The EU treats us very, very unfairly, very badly.
We have to rely on our own defense industrial base. We cannot buy American products when it gets to defense because, you know, there is a string attached. There is a double key.
Zanny Minton Beddoes is editor-in-chief of The Economist and has a front-row seat for the increasingly strained relations between Western Europe and the United States, and how the Europeans are taking it.
This is the first time I've been in New York since President Trump took over, since the inauguration. And I'm struck at how relatively little I think people here are focused on just how dramatically the perception of the US, actually around the world, but particularly in Europe, has changed. But what's happened in the last few weeks has really shocked Europeans because they have realized that a significant element of this administration is outright hostile to Europe. Doesn't like Europe, particularly the European Union as a concept. One shouldn't exaggerate too much from sort of individual moments of theatre because this is an administration that loves moments of theatre. But nonetheless, that dressing down of President Zelensky in the Oval Office had a visceral reaction in Europe because it was watched by, everyone I met had watched it, even people who aren't usually interested in current affairs, and everyone had just been shocked at the treatment of this man, this brave man, speaking in his third language by the President of the United States. And those two were sort of powerful examples of, I think, a recognition in Europe that actually maybe the United States is not a country that Europe can rely on. And the country that created the North Atlantic, the NATO agreement, the country that built the post-war order, the country, the United States, that's always been the backbone of this post-war system, I think Europeans have just been really shocked. And of course, things can change. And of course, there can be a change in the relationship with Ukraine and all of those things. But even if things now go to a more conventional place, Europe has been shocked, and shocked such that I think every single politician in Europe is having to think about, can we rely on the United States? Can we really only think about a world where we spend more and we have a NATO which is the same except that we spend more? Or do we need to think about having a plan B in case this really is a country that is hostile to us and it is outright bent on not having our interests at heart? And that's a really big shift for Europe. And I think that it's something that is the upside, I hope, is that it will be one of those moments that galvanizes Europe.
When you say Europe is shocked, I guess my question is shocked into action. If you're Europe, what do you do? Well,
that's always the question with Europe, that you can have a lot of pearl clutching and then nothing actually happens. But I think you've seen enough already to take a view that this is different. If you look at what's happened in Germany, and Friedrich Merz, the soon-to-be Chancellor of Germany, very clearly saying it's 5 minutes to midnight, we will do everything it takes. And that's a phrase, remember, that is associated with Mario Draghi, who was during the Euro crisis, president of the European Central Bank, and he said they would do everything that it takes to hold the euro together. The same language, Friedrich Merz very clearly signaling that Germany, which is, of course, the biggest economy in Europe and the one that has been obsessed with its fiscal prudence and its debt brake, would do everything that was necessary to increase defense spending. And you've seen other countries in Europe, Poland talking about nuclear weapons. You've seen big changes. And I think this could be one of those moments where the European Commission is galvanized. They're making it easier to find resources to pay for a very significant increase in defense spending. And to give you a scale of it, the European Union countries spend about 1.8% of GDP on defense, which is well below, as President Trump would tell you, the 2% that they're supposed to, and certainly nowhere near enough if they can't rely on the United States. How much Europe needs to spend depends on how, dark a scenario you want to paint in terms of the US turning its back on Europe and the threat posed by Vladimir Putin. But at the very least, it's a doubling of defense spending, 3.5, 3.6% of GDP. That's a huge increase in defense spending. And so one question is, will the Europeans actually do it? Because they're slow growing, they're indebted, they're high tax economies. I think this German shift is a very, very big moment because I think it signals that the one country that has the capacity to borrow a lot more is intending to do so. The European Union can, as it did during COVID, actually issue joint bonds to pay for this. I think you will have more what you call safe assets in Europe, more commonly issued debt, which investors actually may well lap up, because people will be looking for a non-dollar asset that is a safe asset. So I think you could see a big shift in European financial markets. If this money on defense is spent well and spent effectively, you could see a kick-starting to technological innovation. Look at drone capability that's being developed in Ukraine. If the Europeans work with the Ukrainians, provide the financial wherewithal to really kind of develop and scale up that capability, that's an area where Europe is now at the cutting edge of military infrastructure. That's one of the reasons why European defense stocks have been soaring, because there is the potential in Europe to do that. Now, there's a ton of things that could go wrong. Never underestimate European countries' ability to think about their parochial interests rather than what makes sense for Europe as a whole. One of the consequences of what Donald Trump has done may well be to unify Europe, to increase its defense spending substantially, which is, of course, what he wants, but actually also to kickstart Europe's economies and to kickstart its capability of having a financial asset that would, over time, be something which might be, eventually become an alternative to the dollar.
Policy paves the way for defense spending, but financial institutions play a critical role in getting the money to the manufacturers, whether it's startups or major companies. In the EU and UK, the laws on the books make it hard for defense companies to get the capital they need.
I think we see frictions of two kinds. One of the frictions that we're seeing is that for some investors, they're not able to allocate as much of their capital to defense and security startups, because sometimes those startups are put on restricted lists. Traditionally, some investors have shied away from investing in defense and security because it's not seen as being aligned with ESG priorities. I think our view is that, in fact, if we really want to have peace and prosperity, we have to be able to invest in defense and security capabilities so that we can protect our countries, our nations, our communities, and our populations. The other barrier that we're sometimes seeing as limiting the amount of capital flowing into startups is really whether or not the startups can access markets at pace. It's all very well for a ministry to say, look, I'm really interested in buying your new capability. But if it takes them 5 years to provide a contract, that's going to have a really dampening effect on the opportunities that these startups see.
Countries in Europe are under pressure to figure out how to serve their individual interests while addressing a priority for the whole Union.
We may, as you say, be seeing the political will in much of Europe to move forward. Is there the capacity, and particularly, is the capacity in leadership? You've got to make some tough decisions about where to get the money and how to spend it.
You have, and I think the easy answer to your question would be to say, look around Europe and there are only kind of political pygmies. But actually, I think that's, and I've made that argument myself, but I think that's slightly unfair. If you look at, for example, Friedrich Merz, whom I interviewed before the German election, and I asked him about some of these questions. What did Germany need to do on defense and so forth? And he was unwilling to really sort of put his neck out. He was quite cautious. And he's a man who's been a staunch Atlanticist all his life. And, you could forgive that, I suppose, because it was just before an election and he doesn't want to say anything terribly controversial. But it made me worry exactly as you suggest, that is this man someone who can really step up if needed? And frankly, what we've seen since the election, in light of what the President Trump has done, has actually been, I think, pretty remarkable. Others have real constraints. Emmanuel Macron, President of France, I think, loves grandiloquent language and grand gestures, and I'm sure he wants to do all of this. In fact, to his credit, he was the man who, a few years ago said to us that NATO was brain dead and that Europe needed more strategic autonomy. He's worried about this for a long time. His problem is that he's actually very weak domestically, and the domestic politics within France make it harder for him. Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of Britain, I think has come out so far very well. He also he's trying to hew a very difficult line, because on the one hand, Britain traditionally the special relationship with the United States. Our military is particularly entwined with the United States, our intelligence, so forth, members of the Five Eyes, all of that stuff. The Brits are very, very keen to hug the US close. But at the same time, he has worked very effectively with Emmanuel Macron, in particular on Ukraine. He's very clearly trying to shape a European response. And I think he's risen to the occasion. Again, in the UK's case, in order to fund the kind of defence expending that we need to do, he actually needs to do the radical pro-growth reforms which he talked about, but again, we worried that the Starmer government would not be sufficiently bold to do. If he does that, he will also be deserving of the praise. And with him, I think more in hope more than expectation, we put on the cover just a couple of weeks ago Winston Starmer and had him, dressed like Winston Churchill. It's early days. Ask me again in a few months whether they live up to it, but I think those would be the three people I would look out for.
Defense spending is just one part of the bigger European issue of remaining barriers among member states, including in financial regulation and capital markets.
I'm mindful of the name of your publication, The Economist. Can Europe get to where it needs to go without fundamental reform of the capital markets?
The simple answer is no. In the medium term, no. Capital markets union is a kind of aspiration that the European Union has had for a long time and has made very little progress on. I think it's essential. I think the creation of a safe asset that can be a common asset for investors to hold in Europe is essential. I think this stuff can come and will come actually eventually, but you will not have a dynamic European continent without that. I think it's completely essential, but it's not the only thing. There's all kinds of other. You need a much more pro-growth regulatory environment. You need to have a European Commission which is much more focused on creating the conditions for risk-taking, for innovation, for growth, that doesn't think that things needed to be regulated first. I mean, the attitude towards tech has been very telling, right, in Europe, where the European Union has probably got the most aggressive and encompassing tech regulation, but actually, no major tech company to speak of. That kind of thing has to be changed. And I don't want to appear kind of Panglossian. I think it's perfectly possible that Europe could fail to do what we've been talking about. But I do think this moment, these last few weeks, have given Europe a sort of a shock that has had a kind of consequence in Europe that I wasn't anticipating. There is now a sense of urgency. There's a sense of what's at stake, which could just be the galvanizing moment that is needed for this to really happen.